Hello, my name's Tim, and this is Interactional Support, a single case study exploring middle school teachers' social and emotional learning response for students' social and emotional competencies. This is my dissertation defense slide presentation under the guidance of Dr. Guerra. The problem I centered my research on was that school-based mental health interventions and programs are struggling to meet the needs of all students. At the national level, every state has documented youth mental health concerns or unmet needs. Furthermore, at the Department of Education, there's data that indicates that schools are struggling to meet the students' mental health needs. And even further, the CDC predicts future detrimental outcomes if these youth mental health needs are not met as youth grow into adulthood. Expanding on this, the CDC conducts a youth risk behavior survey, which shows increasing youth risk behaviors over a 10-year period, 2009 to 2019. While there have been some improvements in some youth risk behaviors, others continue to grow, which indicates that youth mental health continues to decline. They've labeled this the youth mental health crisis. This may be associated with a cascading effect of support limitations. This includes increasing youth hospitalizations for mental health concerns. Also, data from the APA surveys show that youth demand for mental health support is outpacing the supply of mental health support providers. In addition, half of schools report that they cannot meet students' mental health needs based upon traditional methods like counseling. Yet, SEL programs have the potential to impact youth mental health, but these programs are not yet fully understood. There are multiple mitigating factors that indicate the programs are successful for some students, having good potential to impact their mental health, but not successful for all students. In addition, these studies largely exclude the voice of teachers as the key professionals who are working with students and conducting these social and emotional learning programs. Further still, the middle school experience is one that is identified as a high stress environment, especially as youth undergo adolescence. And as a result, there's a need to understand how teachers are supporting youth, including their mental health, during this developmental stage. This brings me to my purpose. The purpose of this single case study was to explore middle school teachers' descriptions of interactional social and emotional learning implementation and outcomes in a large urban environment in the context of developing students' social and emotional competence as defined by the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning framework for social emotional learning. I had one research question, which was, how do middle school teachers describe their use of interactional social emotional learning to develop students' social emotional competencies as defined by the CASEL framework and their perceptions of the resulting student outcomes? I had a dual theoretical framework. At the center, we can see the circular section, which is the CASEL framework for social emotional learning, including the 5 social emotional competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, which persist across classroom, school, family and caregiver, and community levels. I focused on all 5 of the SECs at the classroom and school level specifically. However, this framework is expanded upon using the systemic SEL framework, which brings in the research-based student outcomes on the right in short-term, intermediate, and long-term timeframes, which we'll note in the long-term also includes support for mental health. I used a qualitative single case study design, which enabled me to investigate the depth of the phenomena specific to the school site. Ultimately, I aimed to capture the essence of teachers' interactional social emotional learning in context of this school. The school itself had a vested interest in youth mental health and social emotional learning specifically, which was known to me due to my EMIC positionality as an employee of the school. The school is described as an urban, coeducational, secular, independent private school in the southern U.S. I used criterion sampling and ultimately identified 8 participants. The 2 criteria involved were that each participant needed to work within the middle school division and they needed to be able to self-identify their use of interactional social emotional learning. Unlike social emotional learning curriculums and programs that have scripted events, interactional social emotional learning is spontaneous, meaning it has to be initiated and understood by the participant themselves. The data collection had 4 parts, including submitted artifacts, where participants submitted a past record of their interactional social emotional learning. They then did 8 weeks of journaling, where they recorded their real-time use of interactional social emotional learning. There was a primary interview exploring that real-time use of interactional social emotional learning, and a follow-up interview exploring the previously submitted artifacts. The data analysis included 5 parts. starting with first cycle descriptive coding, identifying what participants spoke about, also followed by second cycle pattern coding, identifying trends within those descriptions. These were then winnowed to narrow the scope, ultimately leading to the categories and themes, which will be discussed soon. Trustworthiness was key to the study, including credibility, for example, in the use of triangulation in data, also in transferability, which included the rich, thick data collection. In addition, dependability was included through the transparency of the design and analysis, and ultimately confirmability was key in its data-based assertions and data-based evidence use throughout the study. There were some limitations to the study, including participant attrition. The data collection required a lot of time and energy from the participants, meaning some participants were unable to fulfill the data collection due to time and energy constraints. In addition, the asynchronous journaling was a form of data collection that required a lot of autonomy from the participants, and that resulted in some inconsistencies across the journaling and the data collected from those journals. Finally, the small sample size indicated that there is a very low generalizability for this study, and it does not qualify for quantitative analysis. Delimitations included the bounded teacher population, which focused on teachers because they have the most access to students during the school day, in addition to the middle school itself, in order to keep the scope of the study specific to this adolescent developmental period. In addition, there was no student data collected. This was exclusively focusing on the teachers' experiences and perceptions while conducting interactional social emotional learning. From the data analysis, I identified 4 themes. Theme 1 was middle school teachers described using discussion with students to incorporate behavioral strategies like providing alternatives, redirecting actions, and offering support when promoting intrapersonal social emotional competency. Intrapersonal competencies include self-management and self-awareness, and specific forms of behavior support like alternatives are really providing choices to students. Redirection is where there are not choices provided, but the teacher is directing the student to make a change, and support is literally an offer of assistance or aid. Theme 2 was middle school teachers described using discussion with students and collaboration to incorporate emotional support like empathy, praise, and encouragement when promoting interpersonal SEC. The interpersonal social-emotional competencies include social awareness and relationship skills, while the emotional support strategies, like empathy, really focused on validation of students' thoughts, feelings, and experiences, praise, which mainly focused on compliments, and encouragement, which was really emphasizing growth mindset, especially in context of growing students' leadership skills. Theme 3 was middle school teachers described using discussion with students and documentation to support students' responsible decision-making. The use of discussions to engage in students' interactional social emotional learning was consistent across themes 1, 2, and 3. However, the use of documentation was unique to theme 3 in that it was adding to the student record and provided an opportunity to inform key adults like school administration and/or the students' families. Theme 4 was middle school teachers perceived short-term outcomes like accountability and intermediate outcomes like positive social behaviors and relationships after their interactional SEL interventions. The short-term accountability outcomes were primarily observed changes where teachers saw an improvement in a student's words or actions after the intervention, and on the intermediate level, the teachers observed specific changes in student-to-student interactions, especially in the form of collaboration, indicating that positive social behaviors and relationships had improved after the interventions. Each of the 4 themes converged and diverged from past literature. For example, Theme 1 converged with its use of discussion-based behavioral strategies. However, the use of discussion-based strategies was more diverse in other research. For example, the use of role play or the use of other action-based strategies instead of discussion-based strategies were identified in past research. Theme 2 converged with its use of discussion-based emotional support and its emphasis on collaboration, or the interpersonal SECs. However, it also had a limited use of strategies, and the research showed other strategies were also useful. For example, using anecdotes and stories, that being teachers sharing their personal stories with students, or non-intervention conversations, where students and teachers are talking together, but not in the context of interactional SEL interventions, more in the context of just relational conversation. Furthermore, Colley suggested the use of SEC goals and feedback, similar to academic goals, where students set specific social and emotional goals that can then be checked in upon and provided feedback in the same way that teachers provide feedback about academic work. Theme 3 showed convergence with the past literature in its use of discussion-based strategies to support students' responsible decision-making. However, there was divergence in the other strategies supported in the literature. For example, the use of choice and autonomy in addition to specific decision-making processes was supported in the literature but largely unused by my participants. Furthermore, my participants used documentation as a part of their support for responsible decision-making, and this use of documentation was largely absent in other publications. Theme 4 showed convergence with the perceived SEC development as seen in other studies. However, it also showed divergence in that it had specific social-emotional competency outcomes, like accountability. These specific outcomes were not measured in other studies. Furthermore, the use of short-term, intermediate, and long-term timeframes, as suggested by the Systemic Framework for SEL, are absent in other studies and not used throughout the literature. The implications and recommendations apply to 3 specific groups, beginning with teachers. The first implication was recognizing that teachers have unique approaches to social-emotional learning, and the recommendation here is that teachers should share strategies across individuals and teams. This is especially relevant because the literature indicates that many teachers are not trained in social-emotional learning, and by sharing these strategies, they can get informal training among colleagues to expand the approaches and tools that they use to conduct interactional social-emotional learning. The second implication was the perception of social-emotional competency growth, which was limited to the short-term and intermediate timeframes. To alleviate this, the recommendation is to create social and emotional learning profiles of students. These profiles could be created by teachers to document the social and emotional learning development of their students, and when those students transfer to the next year and next set of teachers, those profiles can transfer with them so that new teachers can use that as a starting point to continue the students' social and emotional development. For school administrators, the primary implication is that social and emotional learning takes a lot of time and space to be conducted well by teachers. So to support that, the recommendation is that administrators provide diverse support like training or specific time and space and resources in order to allow teachers to engage in interactional social and emotional learning and further support students' social and emotional competency growth. Researchers have 3 areas of development that can be further investigated to understand social emotional learning even further. This begins with the qualitative student perspective. As noted earlier, I focused exclusively on the teacher perspective, and that is only half of the experience because this is an interaction between students and teachers. So researchers can expand upon this by investigating the student perspective to complete the narrative around interactional social emotional learning interactions between students and teachers. Furthermore, interactional social emotional learning and outcomes are not clearly correlated with time. The Systemic Framework for SEL suggests that there are short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes that are very specific to those timeframes, but the perceptions of my participants did not align with those timeframes. So additional research is needed to understand the relationship between these outcomes and time. Furthermore, as noted in past literature about social emotional learning programs and curriculums, there are multiple factors mitigating the success of social emotional learning, as seen in this study that not all interactions with interactional social emotional learning led to a perceived outcome, and just like the programs are not always completely successful for all students. In both cases, more information is needed to understand what factors mitigate the success of social emotional learning so that more students can benefit from social emotional learning and improve their social emotional competencies. To distribute the findings, I plan to do a professional presentation to the original population at the school site. This will leverage the site's professional development series and provide an opportunity for beneficiaries among the population at the site. Further from that, I would like to present a professional presentation at the NAIS Thrive Conference. This is a collection of teachers and administrators from the broader independent school community and would increase the distribution of the findings in hopes that it can have further influence on how teachers and schools conduct interactional social emotional learning to support their students. Here are the first set of sources. Here are the second set of sources. And here are the final set. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this wide-ranging presentation on interactional social emotional learning. I look forward to learning more, and thank you for your continued support.